Anyways, so today's event is the 7th event of the Transnational and Situated Research Seminar I run at Shanghai Jiao Tong University School of Humanities. And it's based on this edited collection done by the two professors I've invited, Professor Ankhi Mukherjee at Oxford and Professor Ato Quayson at Stanford. And the collection is called Decolonizing the English Literary Curriculum, published by Cambridge University Press last year. And it's a very timely collection that touches upon many core issues about how we think about the English curriculum or the English department or the university as a whole from a decolonial perspective. Professor Ankhi Mukherjee taught me when I was a master's student at Oxford, and she is very productive. She is professor of English and world literatures at the University of Oxford and a fellow at Wadham College. Her most recent book is called Unseen City, The Psychic Lives of the Urban Poor, published by Cambridge in 2021. And it has won the Columbia University's Robert Libert Award for Outstanding Scholarship in the field of applied psychoanalysis. And currently, Ankhi is working on 2 books which have all been contracted. She's writing a very short introduction to post-colonial literature in the Oxford series of very short introductions, and another book with Princeton University called Mavericks and Charlatans, Empire, Modernity, and the Authorization of Dreams. So Ankhi, if you're ready, then we can have your part of the talk first and see if Ato will join in. Oh, I think Ato is here as well. Somehow he managed to get in. That's great. And I will just use this time to introduce Professor Ato Quayson as well, since he is getting ready. So Professor Ato Quayson is the Jean G. and Maurice M. Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies, Professor of English, and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. And he taught at Cambridge, Toronto, and NYU. And he was also the president of the African Studies Association and is an elected fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada, and the British Academy. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2023. He has authored numerous books, 6 monographs, and 10 edited collections. The latest one, including this one, Decolonizing the English Curriculum. There is another collection with Jeannie Kim Watson called The City in World Literature, also published by the Cambridge University Press. And he is now working on a collection of his own essays called Interdisciplinarity and Interpretation, also with Cambridge. So I see both of you have very good working relationship with Cambridge. It's great. Okay. I hope any one of you could be able to speak. Hi, Ankhi, are you there? Yes, you are unmuted. And I can also see Professor Quayson. Yes, Professor Quayson, I can see you. Hi, Professor Quayson. Thank you so much for getting up so early, and sorry for the technical issues. Can you hear us, and can you speak?
I can hear you.
Oh yes, we can hear you as well. So this is working. And Ankhi was there, and the computer worked fine, but I don't know where she went.
It's her husband who is a tech guru. Is the one who sorted. He called me just now and got it sorted. I wouldn't have been able to figure it out myself.
Okay.
This would be our first time in China with the book Decolonizing the English Literary Curriculum, which, as you know, is free to download in perpetuity. So it's an open access book, and we really hope that our readers in China will make full use of it. You can hear me now, Flair? Okay, good. So for my remarks here, I've divided up my talk into 3 sections. The first is the longest section. It's called Why Now? The second is a kind of meditation on my chapter on Zadie Smith. And then the final one is titled Why English? So I'll start. My comments will take about 20 minutes. So Joseph Conrad's writing involved sensation and interpretation, acts of both presenting and representing. As the oft-cited passage from Heart of Darkness goes, the meaning of an episode lies not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze. So meaning adheres to the tale as a haze, waiting for the searchlight of the critic or the reader to unravel its dark life. Ian Watt has famously called this critical method delayed decoding, or the interpretive gap between impression and understanding, whereby an outcome is depicted before the cause of that outcome is satisfactorily presented. As Ian Watt further explains, delayed decoding served mainly to put the reader in the position of being an immediate witness to each step in the process, whereby the gap between the sensation aroused in the individual by an object or event and their actual cause or meaning was slowly closed in his or her consciousness. Delayed decoding is about slower reflexive processes accompanying the fast and forward temporal progression of the mind. Sense impression and meaning are brought together at a lag. Conrad withholds naming the perception or explaining its meaning until later. So for instance, when Marlowe's boat is attacked just below Kurtz's station, inexplicable actions surrounding him, the poleman stretching himself flat on the deck without even taking the trouble to haul his pole in, or the fireman ducking his head, they seem to be related to what Conrad says are sticks, little sticks flying about thick. It is only when Marlowe has finished attending to his duty as a captain that he can finally decode the little sticks. Arrows, by Jove, he says, we are being shot at. So it's not just a fictional characters who process reality through this impressionist technique, where something happens and then you decode the meaning at a lag, but Conrad readers are also made to adopt this interpretive method. So the novels begin as a story, and a story that is sort of forced into length, as Michael Gora says, by Conrad's need to explain, to circle back through time. I have evoked this influential term from Conrad's studies to explain why the discourse on decolonization has come after postcolonial literature and theory sprang fully formed from the brow of imperial history. Why did we return to the indeterminate time of decolonization when the postcolonial epoch seemed to automatically come after the socioeconomic and epistemic depredations of colonial rule? The phenomenon I'm referring to is best described as a delayed and unfinished decoding, whereby retrospective sections struggle to fill in the gaps in the teleological narrative. I mean, any talk of decolonization is almost always about indeterminate time. And I'm turning now to Simon Gikandhi's discussion of the temporality of the interregnum when he talks about decolonization and lives of subjects stranded in time, as it were. Gikandhi cites Hannah Arendt to understand this problem of time as a rupture in what is no longer simply an after or a before. Speaking of Chinua Achebe's The Arrow of God, Gikandhi points out that it is not usually read as a classic work of decolonization because it was written after the end of formal colonialism in Nigeria in 1960. The novel offers neither critique nor disillusionment about the promise of a post-colonial state, fast descending into communal conflicts and a civil war. It is about the African encounter with Europe instead. And yet, Gikandhi argues, The Arrow of God is a definitive work of the crisis of decolonization, a major statement, and I'm quoting Gikandhi here, on that moment when late colonialism came to shape and trouble the culture of the modern, even as it sought to reconstitute African society as an impoverished version of identities and histories that had already been questioned in Europe. Decolonizing the English literary curriculum addresses this crisis of the present, this time of disenchantment with the authority of gods and communitarian traditions, as well as the narratives of a tainted and prefabricated modernity. For me, the impetus to work on this project came with the return of Rhodes Must Fall to Oxford after the death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. I was born and grew up in an erstwhile colony, namely India. My landscape would be flat if we got rid of all of history's, horrible history's relics. But that is the point. In a new world order, you can ignore, museumize, or even laugh mirthlessly at the no dogs, no Indians sign. You can ignore, you have the luxury of distance, you have the luxury of forgetting. Not so in a society where the death of George Floyd left no doubt about the connection of systemic racism to Western colonialism in Asia and Africa. Of course, the situation of Black Britons is not the same as African Americans, but as David Olusoga has pointed out, the problem is that it is not as better as some would like to believe. Black men in particular are stopped and searched at 9 times the rate of white men. Black people make up 3% of the population of England and Wales, but account for 12% of the prison population. The charity Inquest published its findings earlier this year, which said that Black people were 7 times more likely to die than white people following restraint by police. In a brilliant article titled Rhodocycles, Nakul Krishna, once a Rhodes scholar himself, talks about Rhodes Must Fall and the discreet removal in 2016 of a painting of George Nathaniel Curzon from the dining hall in Balliol College, Oxford. Curzon was the Viceroy of India who oversaw one of its major famines in 1899 and presided over the 1905 partition of Bengal. Krishna hadn't heard of a public protest and assumed that this removal had been a quiet swap. I suppose this is how colonialism works, he writes, taking without saying please or thank you, and giving back less than is owed without saying sorry. Oriel College's decision in 2021 to not take down the statue of Rhodes, a white supremacist steeped in colonialism and racism, who used his Oxford degree, earned over 8 years, to consolidate his position in the Cape Parliament, and the branding of Rhodes Must Fall as censorship and cancel culture by the right, made it imperative for me and for us to not take down calls for decolonizing the university. I want to do a little bit of throat clearing now. I'm going to go through the thicket of terms that usually attaches to the term decolonizing. So why decolonizing and not decolonial, anti-colonial, or post-colonial? Decolonizing is the term used for the process of countries in Asia and Africa who began in the 1940s to free themselves from Western rule. Frantz Fanon saw decolonization as a program, this is in The Wretched of the Earth, as a program of complete disorder, one which makes spectators crushed with their inessentiality into privileged actors. It brings with it, he says, a new language and a new humanity. It is not the instrumental violence of colonialism reversed, but one that promises to entirely dismantle the racist worldview and disalienate the colonized individual. The return of decolonization as theory and praxis signals that we are yet to make full sense of the afterness of the violence of colonialism visited on our literatures, languages, cultures, and ontologies. It is a critical gesture of turning to history, rethinking it to understand the twinned processes of a failed post-colonialism and what Bearden Jaifo calls arrested decolonization. Decolonization is far greater than anti-colonial struggles, Fanon cautions, urging that we combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction to address it. Fanon's version of decolonization is not an oppressed people attempting to recover national identity, but a collective attempt to dismantle the very psychological foundations of colonial rule. And its time is the present, a present which has the potential to thwart a future scripted predominantly by the colonial past. A present, in other words, that can imagine and actuate a post-colonial future. Decolonial thought, as inaugurated by theorists such as Walter Mignolo, Catherine Walsh, Arturo Escobar, and others, is a concerted effort to prioritize thinking from below, drawing on different local histories across the globe and different lived experiences. While we are also actively contesting coloniality's totalizing claims and epistemic universality, our subject in decolonizing the English literary curriculum is the English literary curriculum. So it's not possible to de-link and de-westernize in the absolute way Mignolo proposes. Some of our authors have taken the prefix D to break up Western totalities into multiple temporalities, knowledges, and praxis of living, as Mignolo advises we do. But our primary aim is to add, to augment, and supplement. This is not just about the tokenist inclusion of BAME, as we call it, Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic. We call it, that's a term we use in the UK, BAME writers, but contextualization of literary scholarship in the history and afterlives of colonialism and Atlantic slavery. It is additive, and it is about a critical cosmopolitan pluriversalism, as Paul Giles writes in his chapter in our volume, citing Patricia Daly. As Toni Morrison states in the introductory pages of Playing in the Dark about her project of extending the study of American literature into a wider landscape, I want to draw a map, so to speak, a critical geography, and use that map to open as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration as did the original charting of the world, but without the mandate of conquest. So decolonizing the English literary curriculum is about charting a new critical geography without the mandate of conquest. Our book has 4 sections, identities, methodologies, interdisciplinarity and literary studies, and finally canon revisions. These are not airtight divisions. My essay in the identities section, for instance, has overlaps with Jean-Marie Jackson's chapter on African literature. Black British literature is not, I say, an isomorphism for Black identity, while Jean-Marie Jackson speaks of the perils of mining African literary texts for their ethnographic insights. One thing we didn't want to lose sight of in this discussion on decolonizing are the other terms in the title, namely English, literary, and curriculum. Joe Cleary's chapter in the identity section does just that, providing an overview of the English department in Ireland as it evolved from a colonial system to the modern international university. This identity, as it has developed over time, cannot be decolonized without what he calls a fuller reckoning with the past. In the methodology section, Elizabeth McMahon provides pedagogical strategies for decolonizing literary studies in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, with guidelines drawn from Aboriginal authors and indigenized pedagogies. The strategic methods suggested are philosophical, decolonizing historical consciousness through First Nations epistemology, for instance, but they are also pragmatic, relating to transcription, archiving, methods of research, and citation. So Ato's chapter, for instance, Reading for Justice, pulls off a high-wire balancing act against the rarefied idea of literature and the great tradition of English, and its worlding in questions of social equity and racial justice. And Ato recommends interleaving, reading as if what you're reading is part of a larger set of cross-cultural illuminations, is to be open to finding out more about how such cross-cultural illuminations take place. In the interdisciplinarity section, Christopher Krenz argues that postcolonial and disability studies are and always should be allied in their interrogation of power. Ronald Charles decolonizes the Bible as literature, demonstrating how the Book of Revelation has been wrongfully used to subjugate Haitian Christians. He calls Bible education in Haiti a violent colonization program in the name of God. Finally, in the canon revision section, we have experts in different fields of literary study tackle specific pedagogical challenges. The teaching of pre-modern literature, especially the European Middle Ages, with the counter-canonical. Shakespeare as a site of cultural contestation in the US-Mexico borderlands. In an interesting bookend to Cleary's chapter on the changing fortunes of the English department in Ireland, William Ghosh examines the evolving ways in which scholars and teachers have understood the coloniality of the practices they inherited. Debjani Ganguly talks about a multilingual provenance of global Anglophone worlds, just as Akshaya Saxena, in a different section, had spoken about English as a vernacular, not a language of power and dominance. Nigel Leask, in his magisterial overview of Romantic Studies, dwells on his own title of Regis Professor at the University of Glasgow, established by Queen Victoria in 1862, in response to the introduction of competitive examinations for the Indian civil service, in which 1/4 of possible marks were awarded to candidates for proficiency in English language and literature. We look at a wide variety of genres and forms across the sections: poetry, anthology, fiction, short story, autobiography, performance, including Instagram live sessions. So as I said, this is where I kind of dwell a little bit on my own chapter. From the start, our focus was the English literary curriculum, the way in which its anachronistic temporality could be more aligned to decolonized futures. For my chapter, I focused on Zadie Smith's novels and short stories, which see imperialism embedded in the education system, its foundations built into language, literature, intellectual traditions, and the different brow elevations of Anglo-American culture. In her new novel, The Fraud, which is set in 1870s England, the protagonist, Mrs. Touchet, has a theory, and I'm quoting from the novel here, that England was not a real place at all. England was an elaborate alibi. Nothing real happened in England, only dinner parties and boarding schools and bankruptcies. Everything else, everything the English really did and really wanted, everything they desired and took and used and discarded, all of that they did elsewhere. In that difficult traffic between England and elsewhere, in that disorder, in diasporic epistemologies that arises between, I locate the decolonizing charge of Smith's work. Smith is not simply reinforcing the connectedness of a lopsided and unequal world, or pitting Black British writing against a writing that is not delimited by the qualifier white or haunted by questions of racial justice. Smith balks at the fetishization of Black writers. Zora Neale Hurston had a difficult life and died in poverty, but Smith would still like to make a case for her greatness that supersedes crude identity politics, including the notion that Black women are the privileged readers of Black women writers. I was very happy to see this line. It sort of gave me free pass to write as much as I wanted on Zadie Smith. Hurston is my sister, she says, and Baldwin is my brother, and so is Kafka my brother, and Nabokov, and Woolf my sister, and Eliot and Ozick, he states. I want to kind of now move towards closing my talk, and I want to kind of talk about the English curriculum. And this is the section of my talk that's titled Why English? The word curriculum is derived from the Latin verb carere, meaning run, trot, gallop, hasten, speed, travel, or rapidly flow. The concept of the curriculum is a unique, almost self-canceling aggregate of dynamism and stasis, in that the running, trotting, galloping, speeding, and flowing of its root word happen along fixed pathways or ruts. The curriculum is a course to be adhered to, just as race chariots would be disqualified from the game if they went off beaten tracks. The Oxford English Dictionary lists 1633 as the year in which the Latinate term, curriculum, appears in the context of the university, a word associated since then with the processes of qualification and classification of a sequential education. In our collaborative endeavor titled Decolonizing the English Literary Curriculum, we have evoked at every stage the relevant history of the section of the literary curriculum we were addressing, including the allowable innovation built into its prescriptions, innovative possibilities that would be disciplined and policed before the new became credentialized as the normative. With English, there's often a jumbling of literature, language, and ethnicity. You teach English to the English, I have been asked at checkpoints. This is a productive confusion, and the study of English literature in an international frame, made increasingly possible by the non-parochial energies of postcolonial comparative and world literatures and literary criticism, enables literary studies to promote language studies as active cultural media, not looking at languages ethnographically, not simply focusing on the languages of Latin Christian literatures. Our philological home is the earth. It can no longer be the nation, Erich Auerbach had famously written in Philology and Weltliteratur. Auerbach was exiled for more than a decade in Istanbul after being discharged by the Nazis from his post at Marburg University. He goes on to say that the most priceless and indispensable part of a philologist's heritage is still his nation's culture and language. He adds, however, that only when the philologist is first separated from this heritage, then transcends it, does it become truly effective. So what does it mean for the critic to take the earth as their home while also staying attached to national language and literature? How is the balancing act between excursion and circumscription achieved? And for this, you have to read the volume. The English literary curriculum is not innocent of history and its ravages. Imperialism is embedded in universities, its foundation built into language and literary studies. These institutions were set up in the colonies to produce yes-men, mimic men, the cool, level-headed servant of empire, celebrated in Kipling's poem If, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o scathingly comments in Decolonizing the Mind. This agenda continues to manifest in the way in which English is taught at university across the globe, in the institutional imbalance in the teaching of the local versus imported languages and literatures, and in the lack of contextualizing of those imported languages, traditions, theories, and philosophies. For the post-colonial or metropolitan university in Kolkata or Oxford to proclaim liberty from theft, as Ngugi puts it, it must unflinchingly confront colonial legacies through an ongoing scrutiny of unexamined course content and curricula, as well as teaching, learning, and assessment methods. John Guillory points out in his Cultural Capital that canonicity is not just a transmission of value, but a transmission of social relations. In that relay of canonicity, at the site of production, that is the university, social relations are systematized. The relative autonomy of the institution allowing the social relations to function remotely. The curriculum is both the form and the practice of the canon. Decolonizing the curriculum entails not only generating lists of non-canonical works that can be gobbled up by and as the canon, but challenging and rearranging educational institutions. The institution that's the apparatus of the transmission of legacies of domination and exploitation. Our task, as I've said before in this volume, has been additive, not redactive. And there are several ways in which we have collectively achieved this. Examining canonical works as world literary texts, circulating as translations and reworkings, amplifying the unlived out lives of great books and forgotten books alike, the reinvention of genres and traditions, and finally, generating new critical and theoretical toolkits drawn from anti-colonial thought and praxis. I began my comments with the idea of a delayed decoding, implying that, like Achebe's Ezeulu, we are yet to make full sense of the afterness of the violence of colonialism. Ours is an ongoing and perhaps interminable effort that attempts to reconcile the long memory and historical continuum of English language and literature with salutary shocks of change. Decolonizing the English literary curriculum will, we hope, swell the bibliographies and expand the critical horizons of teaching English literature. More significantly, the lasting impact of the work will be related to the fact that this common cause has succeeded in rallying perspectives from Africa, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Indian subcontinent, North America, and East Asia, and across generations of scholars at different career stages in a wide variety of higher education institutions. Through the lens of decolonization, we have looked at issues of human rights, disability and mental health discourse, the unfreedoms of gender and sexuality, and the relationship between the classic and vernacular languages or major and minor literatures. We are an allied but non-identical group. This volume represents the process of going off the beaten track with the English literary curriculum as we articulate how it can or ought to travel in our post-colonial and global worlds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ankhi, for the nice talk. And let's now just proceed to Professor Quayson's part. If we can condense the talk a little bit and leave maybe 10 minutes for interaction, that would be great. Yeah. But it's up to you, Professor Quayson, of course. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, I will. Ankhi has laid out, I mean, there are a lot of things that she has laid out that was also echoing in my mind. So what I'll do is that I'll share just a few points about the volume and decolonizing the curriculum. The first is the necessity to be conscious of context specificity. That is to say, to decolonize the curriculum in New Zealand and Australia, which are both white settler colonies, is quite different from decolonizing in the UK, in India, or in Ghana. So, for example, the US offers an especially complex set of considerations to think about or to bear in mind for decolonizing. Like New Zealand and Australia, it starts out as a settler colony, meaning that indigenous peoples and their modes of literary representation have always to be attended to or kept in mind. But from the 16th century, the US also became a slave economy, with the transatlantic slave trade altering the nature both of American society and of the social hierarchies that could be seen evolving within it. And then from the beginning, so we have the indigenous populations, we have the slavery, but we also realize that the US is a society of steady immigration of Europeans, fleeing famines, social disasters, and political and religious persecutions. Now, when they arrive in the United States, the mode of colonization is built upon certain exclusions. Amazingly, certain exclusions, not just of people from other parts of the world, but even hierarchies among Europeans. So Italians and the Irish are demonized until the late 19th century. And into the mid 20th century, there are all kinds of devices to highlight the privileges of certain white folk against others. And of course, to create a colonial order. So to decolonize in the context of the United States requires a sensitivity to this complicated hierarchizing context. Ankhi has already stated the difference between the decolonial and to decolonize. So decolonization versus the decolonial. I'm going to skip that. There's a really important point about decolonization. When we at least Ankhi and I speak about decolonization, we're not just focusing or highlighting or indeed privileging the perspectives of minority groups. What we are interested in is setting up an alliance amongst equity-seeking groups, so that a primary consideration for decolonizing the curriculum has always come from calls for reform of the curriculum from equity-seeking groups. What we mean by equity-seeking groups are groups who consider themselves somehow excluded from the hegemonic order of things. And historically, the equity-seeking groups shift historically. But minimally, they would include indigenous peoples, of course, pertaining to Australia, Canada, and the US. They would include people of color and racial minorities, persons with disabilities, persons with non-heteronormative sexual orientations, formerly colonized people, women, Jews, Muslims, and many others. A true decolonial or decolonizing project would have to be intersectional. That is to say, not only looking at one interest group, but trying to establish a link between different interest groups. Let me give an example of intersectionality, which is the next point. In my chapter, I write about how in The Great Gatsby is called or is insinuated, the N word is insinuated, that in other words, that Gatsby somehow is black. But he's not black, he's a white man. So I talk about it there. But there are many ways in which an intersectional reading can bring to the foreground things that bring different equity groups together. When you think of, for example, the Merchant of Venice, Shylock, and the way he's spat at, he's called a dog, and so on and so forth, we could readily apply a Fanonian lens to interpreting Shylock. In other words, we would be reading Shylock as subject of a Fanonian order of things. And this would immediately align Shylock, he's Jewish, to a certain mode of blackness. We also think that decolonizing requires interdisciplinary perspectives. So, environmental studies, animal studies also have to infuse the way we decolonize. And then finally, we have to draw a distinction or be conscious of a distinction between decolonizing the syllabus and decolonizing the curriculum, because decolonizing the syllabus requires different resources. It is the focus is different from decolonizing the entire curriculum. There are many things to think about, but I'll just highlight two of them. The first is that every syllabus should be orchestrated in such a way as to act as a portal to the entire curriculum. So no syllabus should be designed as an enclave. I think, for example, in African literature, most students coming to African literature, obviously they're coming to study Africa. But in fact, I design my syllabi in such a way that the African literature syllabus, so reading about Achebe, is actually a way of understanding Shakespeare and Sophocles and Joyce and so on. Now, the way of doing this is always to orient the syllabus in such a way that it is open to cross-referencing the entire curriculum. In other words, the students are not being inducted into an enclave, which is labeled African literature, but rather being ushered into a way of reading all of English literature, but from a particular standpoint. And this distinction is really important because it's very easy to say that, well, I'm not a specialist on Shakespeare, so I dare not reference Shakespeare or encourage comparison between Shakespeare and Achebe in my classes. I think that's a mistake. At any rate, reading each book as interleafing each book, Ankhi has already referred to this, interleafing each book as somehow related to all of the curriculum, not part of the curriculum, as a mode of orientation, also helps for us to radically desegregate it, because there's a sense in which the curriculum is segregated in a variety of ways, to desegregate and de-siloize it. So I have a lot of other things to say, but these would be my comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Quayson. So now we have 18 minutes left for some Q&A and engagement with the audience. So as the audience, you can type in the question in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function, and I will unmute you and you can speak to the professors themselves. But before that, I guess I will allow some time for people to prepare, and I will take the privilege and just engage with the professors with some questions. So I did read the volume, many chapters, and absolutely the very nice introduction you've put together. And after listening to your talks today, I think I've become even more clear about the central impulse behind this project. I do have several interrelated questions. The first one is to do with this point that Professor Quayson just stressed, that it's not just about the minorities, right? And in the introduction, you wrote that the chapters in the volume all share the central impulse of something that is like tied to the correction of social anomalies specifically linked to the situation of oppressed or underrepresented minorities. So the minorities politics is key, but again, you also use the term called global majorities. So sometimes, we have these terms like people of color, majorities, minorities, but what is minority in one context becomes majority in another context. So I just wonder for the both of you, what's this link between minorities, as oppressed groups in the West, and then the global majorities that's maybe in the world order, even though we are the majority, but somehow in, for example, the curricular force, or how these cultural institutions are designed, we become minoritized. So what's the tension between the minorities within the Western context and then the international context, where we do have the global majorities and our own traditions, especially for countries, for example, like China, Japan, India, where there are a lot of indigenous classic traditions that are also kind of in tension with this compelling English curriculum that is, world literature sometimes called, right? So I just wonder, how do you configure that?
Ato, would you like to take the question, because you have eaten into your time to speak? Please go ahead.
Well, I don't think I understood the question, or at least what I understand is the difference between minorities in specific context, state context, and majorities in general. Is that what, Flair? Is that what you're driving at?
Yes. Yeah, because what is minorities in the West actually are global majorities, right? Like the terms you use, the people of color actually are global majorities. And then most of people of color who live in their own countries, they don't have this term for people of color until they go to the West, to have this concept.
Yeah, well, by definition, a minority is context specific. I mentioned earlier. So, for example, in China, you do have minorities. You have the Uyghurs, the Muslim Uyghurs, if I'm pronouncing correctly, who have been waging a long campaign to acquire more freedoms. At least from the way it is reported. So for them, in that context, they are a minority. Now, if they left there and went to a Muslim majority country, they may not have the same pressures. So the question, you are a minority in context. In my country, I come from Ghana, I'm not a minority. I'm a majority because we're all of the same race. The key thing is to also view the problem from the perspective of those who claim to be persecuted. Because the hegemonic order, so a majority, white world, for them to see through their privilege, it is required that they listen or at least acknowledge the voices and the perspectives of those who have no power. I think that's the key thing about majority minority, is who is it that does not have power, or that feels oppressed, or that feels excluded. And this will be context specific. In terms of global versus local, of course, if you leave your domain of minoritization, like me, and you go back to, then the question changes. Then if I was in Ghana, I would have to think, who is the minority? Because there are, of course, they're poor people, for example. So the racial question gets transformed into a class question, and so on. That's how I would see it.
If I can sort of pick up on that, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and what is, and this is something I touched on a little bit when I was working on my book, What is a Classic, that, with English acquisition in China, for instance, if 30 million Chinese people speak English, and what would that say of kind of, that particular idea that English is not just a language, but it's also a culture, it's also an ethnicity, it kind of completely changes in every way the complexion of English studies with kind of, these populous regions kind of, using English as a global vernacular. So I kind of take that point that, that idea of a minority has to be sort of calibrated and recalibrated all the time. And also, if you look at somebody who is seen as a sort of marginalized or a minority person in kind of, let's say, the Faculty of English at Oxford, could herself be from a kind of fairly, in India, which is so very classist and casteist, could herself also be from a privileged position, could be a privileged minority. So all that is there. But I think, as Ato says, the point is not to sort of, in a way, kind of have these umbrella terms, but nuance them, but to also seek solidarities, that this is not just, we are not just doing something, this is not some kind of a bomb making factory we are creating under English departments, but we are sort of saying that we stand to gain from the sort of the dissenting energies of all these other, as I mean, Ato has this wonderful term, equity seeking groups. We stand to gain from that. It's a narcissism of minor differences to say that what the decolonizing section of the department or faculty wants is very different from what, let's say, kind of, the feminist or the animal studies or the eco-critics want, that there are ways in which we could kind of find common ground, and we could sort of, in a way, provide, this term that became so powerful during Roads Must Fall, and also sort of after the death of George Floyd, allyship, that can provide allyship.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for the question, for the answers. And we do have one question from the audience. I will just read it. Thank you, professors, for your insightful presentations. If I understand correctly, this book addresses the urgent needs to reform English literary studies by integrating perspectives from marginalized and underrepresented voices. It critically examines the colonial foundations of the traditional literary canon and proposes methods for incorporating more diverse range of text and authors into the curriculum. To some extent, this aims to establish a new decolonized continuum in English literature, fostering a new global connection, which will inevitably involve the exploration of new aesthetic values. In the current literature from the global south, the theme of nostalgia is often invoked to attempt to reshape cultural roots. Does this resonate with the aesthetic value exploration in your book? Maybe nostalgia about a colonial power or a past before colonialism. How do people imagine tradition with this decolonial method, maybe?
I can probably take a stab at that. One of the things, one of the places where we took the book was to the Kolkata Literary Meet in India this January. And the person who was interviewing me, a very, very senior professor of English, actually as a Shakespearean, he said, the problem with a lot of Indian universities, including the very top one that he was attached to, is that we don't have people to teach Chaucer or to teach Shakespeare. So similar kind of, nostalgia, or sort of like you could say decolonial thinking is happening, where there is no longer investment in a kind of an English department on the kind of more traditional English studies. And you have the opposite of that at a place like Oxford. And I can only talk about the place, that I'm kind of so embedded in, that it's not that we haven't been teaching Rushdie and Naipaul and kind of Zadie Smith and, or Achebe. It's not that our Walcott, he was one of our very popular special author options. It's not that they have not been there, but what has been pernicious is that division between what is a compulsory education in English and what is an elective. What's the center and what's the periphery? And decolonizing, as Ato says, it's very important to think it's not just the syllabus, but it's the curriculum, the way in which the course is meant to run, the way in which it is meant to give you these sort of, these kind of the skilled practice, and what is constituted to be urgent and immediate there, and what's understood to be expendable. And that's what it's not just sort of recovering these voices. The voices are there, they're at large, they're Booker winners and Nobel winners, but it was quite possible until a few years ago for an undergraduate to get a BA in English degree from Oxford and not have read a single author of color. So, and we are not shoehorning identity politics, but simply saying that this is also English. Edward Said has that wonderful line in Culture and Imperialism where he says, in Great Expectations, it shows that it is, of course, Pip's Great Expectations come from Australia through Magwitch, who has been sent to this penal colony. But it also shows that it shows Australia's England. It shows this connected world. So if it's England's India, it's also India's England. It's a part of a sort of fairly coercive networking that we have some of us have been subjected to, that, and it's foolish to sort of deny that connection. And it is pernicious to actually still carry on a kind of colonial hierarchy where these authors, who inhabit that continuum of English education are seen as arrivists and interlopers. And so that's what the decolonizing thing is meant to do. So yes, to sort of combat the pernicious nostalgia, which is a false history, because the histories are connected. We are here because you were there.
Right. The other thing, just I might add, is that apart from everything else, we also want to inculcate certain skills in our students. One of it involves the range of literatures they are exposed to. Now, the question of addition, what do we add? is always going to be a question that has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed also in terms of the personnel. So you don't just add English, Indian literature or African literature. You hire people who are of Indian descent or African descent who can teach it. So resource questions will always be an issue. But I think that the additive question has been, as it were, exhausted. There's no English department that I can think of who say, no, we don't want you to study Salman Rushdie or Chinua Achebe or Zadie Smith. I think that question, that war battle is already won. However, there's another important skill that we need to inculcate our students, and that is the curiosity to continue learning. But curiosity about what? This is where the earlier question links up to the second question, because the curriculum could be shaped in such a way that they may end up being curious only about certain types of literatures, but not others. Because the way the syllabus, Ankhi has already mentioned this, the way the curriculum is established, you can take all the courses in Western writing, and all the courses in non-Western writing are optional. So it's entirely possible to complete a degree at Oxford or even Stanford here and not have access or be introduced properly to any other literature but Western or Euro-American writing. I think this is pernicious because ultimately you want the student to have both range, but to also be able to carry their curiosity further. But how can they be curious about something that they've never been exposed to before? And so this is part of, the two questions are related. Each section of the curriculum has to be taught or designed in such a way as to interconnect to all other sections. I'm against enclave building. The idea of an enclave is anathema to me. So each section of the syllabus should be designed or oriented in such a way that the students are being ushered into the whole world of literary studies, not some of it.
Okay, understood. So there's a last question by Luca from Macau University. Luca, do you want to ask the question yourself since you're already unmuted? Or I can just read the question, I guess. So the question is, what is the relationship between the decolonizing discourse and processes unfolding within elite Western universities versus the decolonial struggles and literary movements emerging from working class and marginalized communities in developing countries like China and Indonesia? So there's the question of class, I guess.
Yeah, well, you will have to answer that question, because I don't know enough about the Chinese or the Indonesian situation. It's a question you have to answer candidly. In Indonesia and in China, which are the groups that are feeling themselves still not heard or marginalized? Is it women? Is it Chinese women? Is it working class women and men and so on? The sensitivity to the question, and the question is easy to answer from newspapers, from stories that circulate and so on and so forth, from people who claim not to see themselves in the literature or the films and the representations. Now, once you identify them, the next task is, how do you incorporate them and teach them in such a way as not to render them as just an addendum? Because it's possible to teach minority literatures just simply as an addendum, but rather as co-equal in terms of what it can deliver about aesthetic values, about form, and so on and so forth. It's a question that you have to answer.
Yes. Ankhi, do you want to say anything about it?
Yes, and again, you know, I mean, I mentioned Zadie Smith earlier, and she's very good at that. And that's one of the things we're also saying, that there are no, in a way, there are no pieties to any one category, let's say race, because one of the things she's especially explores in her this is true of a whole range of authors, Teju Cole, Caleb Azuma Nelson. I was talking about his Open Water, that there is no piety associated to blackness, for instance, and often you will find that there is a sort of, in a way, a way in which kind of a black middle class character is fairly oblivious of the plight of a white middle class man, and the authors go there because there is no point in sort of, in a way, they're embracing these inequalities in both their imbricated nature, but also sort of, fairly dispassionately and fairly unemotionally. So yes, I mean, and as Ato says that, this is one of the reasons why I mentioned Rhodes Must Fall and I mentioned the death of George Floyd, because that was really the sort of watershed moment for both of us. But these crises will keep happening, and we hope that we have gathered, kind of models of how to, in a way, speak to that moment, and speak to that moment. And as I said, that we are, what Ato said and what I said, we are both deeply, not just entrenched in, but we love a lot of the Western canon. We love reading it, we love teaching it, but we are introducing attitudes that read it otherwise, that read it sort of, in a way, contrapuntally with other, not just other literatures, but also other languages. We ourselves come from different languages. For us, English is a vernacular. English is not necessarily our mother tongue. So it's something that we have domesticated and vernacularized. So I do think that, all these complexities can be, displaced to a different region, let's say China. It can be displaced on a different political crisis, and you could have new work on it. We were responding to our crisis, and we thought that would be a good moment to see what was happening in medieval studies, Shakespeare studies, 18th century studies at that moment. How it was a kind of very timely reckoning, because we felt, as you do often, that it's very important to kind of say that the university has a connection to the world outside. And for all the ways in which language and literature, I mean, Said's Orientalism says that everything is compromised, everything is suffused with power, and knowledge and power are sort of, these policing methods. But if Ato and I did not believe that there was a non-coercive form of knowledge, then we would not be writing this book. So for every form of coercive curriculum, there is the alter curriculum, there is the other curriculum that we need to also put in course. And that's kind of what we were doing. And I hope that, your questioner will kind of do it in a different context. We'll take a leap from this book and sort of, start a new project.
Yes, this is it's certainly very inspiring. And of course, the central mission or the political charge of the book doesn't have to be limited to the English curriculum. We can decolonize the French curriculum, the Chinese curriculum. There are a lot of other curricula like world literature or even film studies that all can be, decolonized in one way or another. Maybe even though in the Chinese context, maybe sometimes decolonization is not really the term, but maybe diversification or other terms that can include other paradigms. But certainly the sense of mission you bring with this book is very important for the entire field. And for that, we really thank you. So I guess time is up, and we did say that we want to stick to the original time plan. And thank you so much for both of you, especially for Professor Chris for getting up so early and finally logging in and stuff. And thank you, Ankhi, so much for finally successfully getting in, and for your husband's work to help both of you to get in. And I will get in touch again by email about the logistics after this. And thank you so much. And we will share the book with the group as well, since it's open access.
Yes, please do share. Please do. I mean, that's one of the beauties of the book, that it can actually travel when we are not traveling, and when we are stuck with all these problems of communication, the book can actually speak to you. So please make sure that everyone knows it's open access.
Circulate, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. If you do have a chance to come to China, certainly come to Shanghai, and we can get together again in person. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you
so much. Bye. Apologies again for the tech issues.
Okay. Bye.